I'm with Shuvaloy Majumdar, the former political advisor to Canada's former Foreign Minister, John Baird. Mr. Baird, of course, was with the Conservative government, which is in opposition to the current government of Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who leads the Liberal Party of Canada. And Mr. Majumdar is also the Monk Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is a think tank in Ottawa. And today we are discussing the truckers, a protest by truckers in the heart of Canada in downtown Ottawa for the last couple of weeks, about 19 or 20 days. And we will talk about all this. There is an India angle, but let me first welcome Mr. Majumdar. Welcome to ThePrint.
Great to be here. How are you?
You are in Ottawa. It's morning your time. It's late evening in New Delhi. But Mr. Majumdar, we've been watching with some fascination, may I add, the truckers' protest and how Prime Minister Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister, has actually invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canada's history to deal with the peaceful protest of truckers in the heart of Ottawa. And all this despite the Ukraine crisis, the US and Russia talking to each other over the last couple of weeks. But the truckers' protest has made it to the headlines in Indian newspapers. Explain to me what's going on.
Listen, in Canada, we are a bit behind the curve when you look at other Western democracies that have high vaccination rates, public compliance. Canadians are amongst the most rule of law abiding people on earth. Over nearly 90% of Canadians are fully vaccinated. And I think the truckers' protest represents broad public sentiment of performative pandemic politics by the Prime Minister and the federal government on a range of issues. There's a desire to get back to work, a desire to get back to some form of normalcy. And I think that what had happened is all that bubbled over, and truckers who wanted to be able to do what they need to do to provide for the livelihoods of Canadians, as well as for themselves, took to the streets, and they took in peaceful protest in large form. And they came to the capital, as well as have popped up throughout the country. It's a mass national movement of people who want to just move on with their lives.
But you live in Ottawa, and why has the Canadian Prime Minister invoked the Emergencies Act? I mean, he wants to disperse the protest, but why would he invoke the Emergencies Act, for crying out loud?
Listen, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, is perhaps the most performative pandemic politician on earth. As the public sentiment had been building around the protests in Ottawa, his focus principally was to call them out for being representative of a fringe minority of white supremacy. He catcalled the wide public sentiment as opposed to address and engage it sincerely, to try and deflate the situation and to take what these people, these honest people, were raising to the national capital to heart. Instead, he chose to inflame it with incendiary rhetoric. He decided to frame the protests as public belligerence. And I believe he's at a stage now where what he has pronounced would be true needs to be true to justify his lack of engagement and just general democratic behavior. So in my sense, my assessment of it is that this could have been dealt with early by taking the sentiments of the protests seriously, even if they were informally organized, rather than look to inflame the situation and invoke emergency measures that were not even needed to restore the rule of law in critical national infrastructure choke points like the Ambassador Bridge, which is a source of huge trade between Canada and the United States.
So let me understand this properly, Mr. Majumdar, and forgive me because we are a few thousand miles apart and lots of things happening in India, including a very important 5 states going to the polls. But let me understand this. So Canadian truckers wanted to cross into the US, and like you said, many of them are vaccinated. About 90% of Canada's population is vaccinated, like you say. And there were conditions to them crossing over and crossing back. Is that correct? And that's why they're protesting?
There was a galvanization around some of those things. Listen, it's not necessarily about a specific request around being able to move across the border. It's the larger sentiment about ending the vaccine mandates, even after Canada's chief public officer of health had indicated much of the mandates restricting the mobility and lives of Canadians have now expired. We've seen the Omicron variant spill into Canadian society like we have in other parts of the world. And our health systems and our people have largely proven to be quite resilient in the face of it. And so when it no longer makes sense to have these mandates imposed on citizens across the country, wide public sentiment is to say, time to stop with the politics, Prime Minister, time to come up with a plan for ending these mandates and allowing Canadians to return to ordinary life, time to stop using this pandemic for political gain. And I think that's the large the large sentiment underpinning the protests we've been seeing across Canada.
So these protesters or these truckers, are they vaccinated? But so what is the issue? I mean, what I don't get is that why is so if you're not vaccinated or if there are conditions for you to travel in and out of the US, but why would you still impose the Emergencies Act because you're protesting peacefully at the heart of the capital? Is that correct?
Well, see, part of the rationale for the Emergency Act being imposed is the way in which the truckers had blockaded the Ambassador Bridge. So across that bridge is the key economic portal between Canada and the United States. It's one of the most successful economic relationships in the world, the Canada-US free trade relationship. The goods and services that go across that border are massive and critical to both Canadian and American economic life. When the truck protesters decided to blockade that bridge, they overstepped what would be defined as peaceful protest into blocking critical national infrastructure. That is a violation of the rule of law. Now, in Canada, there are measures to deal with how you impose the rule of law, whether it's with a protest you like or a protest you don't like. If you wanted to freeze the bank accounts of individuals or focus on bringing people who are breaking the law to account, you can take an order to a judge. The judge rules of the order. There's room for accountability around those decisions, and you implement the rule of law. It's not clear why the Prime Minister has invoked the Emergency Act. This is the first time it's been done in the country's history for the sake of implementing the rule of law when he already had all the instruments available to him. Worse, he had 2 weeks, as you've noted, to engage the broad sentiments around the protests, to encourage the protesters and those who are blockading the border to go home. He had an opportunity to say, here's my plan, Canada, for how we're going to deal with ending the vaccine mandates. Here's how I respect the health and vaccine choices of all Canadians. And here's how I'm going to de-escalate the situation by engaging what many people in the country demand, which is a return to normal based on the science. So that's, if I could say it that way, I think that those are the underpinning sentiments and instruments he had available.
But what I find very odd is that, you may or may not remember, Mr. Majumdar, but in India, around Delhi for over a year, protesters, Sikh protesters, non-Sikh protesters from Punjab, Haryana, parts of Uttar Pradesh, collected around the capital protesting 3 farm laws that had been passed by the Narendra Modi government. Now, those were taken back a few months ago, but the protesters, they sort of lasted, or they stayed around and they pitched their tents outside Delhi, on the outskirts of Delhi, for a full year. And Prime Minister Trudeau, your Prime Minister, waded into that, saying that these protesters must be allowed to protest. And he was, and I think his comments went down very badly in India because it was a peaceful protest, except for one violent incident on India's Republic Day last year. And today he can't handle a civilian protest that's lasted 2 weeks.
It's the hypocrisy. My usual refrain here in Canada is that together, Canada and India form 1.4 billion people of free democracies. We're both great democracies who respect the value of a peaceful protest, who respond to democratic sentiments. And true, the Prime Minister was pandering to a particular voting constituency in Canada when he demanded that Prime Minister Narendra Modi engage the protesters, encourage peaceful protest, and address those sentiments. It was well outside of his lane of areas to comment on, and it threw the relationship into a tailspin unnecessarily in a time in which supply chain issues, authoritarians on the march around the world required Canada and India to work more closely together. So it was poorly timed on the basis of domestic politics. And then today you see this massive discord between what his advice was to Prime Minister Modi and what he's doing here in Canada, which is principally to invoke Emergency Measures Act, not engage in dialogue with the broad public sentiments underpinning legitimate protests, peaceful protests, and take draconian measures that are frankly dangerous when it comes to the concept of Canadian democratic life. in Canada, what we've now opened the door to doing is that political leaders, particularly the Prime Minister, might be able to invoke the Emergency Measures Act against protests that they don't necessarily agree with. That's not, encouraging national unity. It's dividing the country. And ultimately, it is performative. It is designed to try and make true the kind of rhetoric the Prime Minister deployed 2 weeks prior to the truck protests arriving in Ottawa.
But he belongs to the Liberal Party. He's a Democrat, or at least he professes to be. So I find it a little odd that he would invoke such a serious measure without even talking to the protesters, or at least sort of throwing a lifeline of dialogue to them.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi set a bit of a model for how to deal with this. Indian democracy, as you well know, is quite robust. And the protests that had preeminently emanated from Punjab and from UP around Delhi has, as you noted earlier, significant political consequences for Indian elections just around the corner. Mm-hmm. The fact that he sent 3 senior ministers to engage with his informal group of protesters, that he had a protracted dialogue for a very long period of time, and ultimately capitulated on the reforms that he wanted to implement right away in favor of a dialogue that would take longer and bring more people on board in the longer term. I mean, that I think was a model for how a democratic leader should act in the context of these types of broad public resistance. None of this happened with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Prime Minister Trudeau has been focused on leveraging the pandemic and its politics for his own personal gain, even up to having an election last year that wasn't even necessary, in which he spent every day on the campaign trail, diminishing the unvaccinated Canadians, people who, for whatever reasons, found cause and skepticism to accept a vaccine. Now, I'm not saying don't take a vaccine. I'm a proponent of vaccines. I'm a proponent of public health. But I do believe firmly in the right of Canadians to have sovereignty over their own health and vaccine choices. And the way to engage that sentiment isn't to demagogue them. It is to speak reasonably and rationally and seriously with people who disagree with you. So to your point, Prime Minister Trudeau is certainly exhibiting authoritarian tendencies in a time in which more democracy is needed, not less.
No, but you would say that, Mr. Majumdar, because you're with the Conservative Party, which is in opposition to the Liberal Party, to Trudeau's party. But the fact is, he did win the election last year, and so quickly within it's sort of I suppose it's within the year of the election since he became Prime Minister again that these incidents have taken place. But what is truly surprising is that he's unable to deal with them.
Well, let me say, the sentiments I'm reflecting here are not partisan. I think a lot of Liberals, including in his own caucus, have departed from the Prime Minister's line on this. In the last 2 weeks, we've seen 2, maybe 3 very prominent Liberal members of Parliament depart his caucus and condemn his government's politicization of this pandemic, accusing the Prime Minister of being performative rather than substantial around the real underpinning issues of this protest. So forgive me for asserting it, but I do believe that across parties, there is a broad consensus that the Prime Minister is not handling this issue well, and that at the end of the day, he's not providing a plan to Canadians that ends the vaccine mandates and allows us to return to normal and focus on growing our economy, which is something all of our countries need to be focused on in this post-pandemic environment.
But then what is it really about? If his own advisors or if his own sort of political circle is shying away from or, disagreeing with him on this particular matter, what is it about then? Why is it that he's still unable to reach out to the protesters, to the truckers?
Jyoti, that's $1 million question that I think is best positioned to the Prime Minister himself. I think that's a very fair question as to why he insists on politicizing a pandemic rather than focusing on helping Canada move beyond it. And it will be an incredible test. Now, the Emergency Measures Act requires within 60 days a tabling to Parliament, a public inquiry in terms of the nature of why this act had been invoked. Mm-hmm. And then a year from now, a parliamentary report that describes why the government went to such great extent to impose these measures. I'm not confident that the basis in which these measures were invoked satisfy what a court would agree with. And I think these questions are going to be asked many, many times over the course of the next year.
So some people have been saying, people in writing in Canadian newspapers, that perhaps one of the reasons why he is taking this very hard line is that he wants it he wants the Canadians, to evoke the memory of the January 6th incidents of last year that took place in Capitol Hill in the US Parliament, in the Congress, when protesters sort of came inside the Parliament and were violent about, holding up legislators, locking them up in their rooms and exhibiting sort of violent tendencies. Does he want to do that? Does he want to sort of evoke this image and in the minds of Canadians about these truckers?
Jyoti, I have to tell you, as a protest began to descend upon Toronto and Ottawa, what we saw was an overcapacity, a real desire by the Liberal Party, by many of the media, to make this Canada's January 6th moment, to define these protests as insurrection, to argue that a lot of foreign money is coming in to interfere with Canadian life, and this is something that is, comprised of an enemy to Canada. It's deeply distressing because, having taken a walk through the protests myself, having seen and engaged with many of these protesters, I can tell you in Ottawa, they clean up the garbage. They're polite to people passing by. There are some offensive signs. There's some absolutely vile signs. But so you have that in any types of protests across the political spectrum, on the left or on the right.
But what kind of offensive signs? Like Nazi signs? What kind of signs? You did have a display of the Nazi sign and of Confederate flags on day one, but they have not been seen since. Mm-hmm. What you had were some bad actors who acted poorly, and like a bright light attracts all kinds of bugs, show up at these protests to try and advance their pet causes. But none of it would have been representative of the wide number of people who had been protesting peacefully, using their civil liberties to do so. So there was an overemphasis trying to represent this as Canada's January 6th moment, which it has not been. And largely, these protests have been, law-abiding people who are frustrated that they can't get back to work. So I think, the Prime Minister and his advisors seem to be very keen to define this as Canada's January 6th moment, which again is deeply unfortunate because it misses exactly what the wide number of Canadians are trying to tell him and his government about moving beyond vaccine mandates and producing a plan on how Canada can return to normal. What really, boggles the mind is that India, with its 1.3 billion people, and while here in the Indian press, some of us are quite critical of the way the Modi government handled the Punjab protests on the outskirts of Delhi, but Canada with sort of 35 million people, and you can't handle a protest like this, it's quite odd, isn't it?
Well, listen, I think both of our democracies are robust and vibrant, and I think that this pandemic has been very tough on a lot of people. And while Indian farm protests were about something critical to the Indian economy, at the end of the day, 50% of the Indian population produces only 13-14% of Indian GDP. That's not a sustainable figure. Agricultural reforms are necessary and very important public policy decisions to take, and very thorny politically, as you well know. In Canada, we've had an opportunity to move beyond the vaccine mandates. We've seen in the United States how there's been a return to normal. We're hearing the expert advice of public health officials, both provincially at the state level and nationally in the central government, that it's time to relax these measures so that Canadians can get back to work. Inflationary pressures on prices for oil and gas.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Majumdar, but is it just about vaccine mandates, or has it gone beyond that?
It's about returning to normal. Our economy is now in a position where inflation is having huge impact on ordinary life. Mm-hmm. There's been an imposition of a gas tax, a carbon tax that has increased the price of gas to heat the homes of Canadians in the extreme cold. So people are feeling the price pinch on a lot of different levels. They're extremely economically insecure about the future. And I think they're right to expect and demand their government to produce a plan for how we can get back to work, back to normal, and try and survive what the deadly costs of the pandemic have been. Okay.
So, India's in the Indo-Canadian population, if you like, is about 1.7 million, I believe, of which 700,000 are Sikhs of Indian origin. But there aren't that many Indians, people of Indian origin in these protests, are there?
There's all kinds of people in these protests. I would have to say I've seen many Indo-Canadians protesting, many Black Canadians protesting. This is Black Heritage Month in Canada. We've seen Asian Canadians from all walks of life. We've seen them represented across these protests across the country. To try and singularly say that this is, white and rural is, I think, false, patently so. Protests are not monolithical. Many people have divergent reasons for why they have shown up. But principally, the uniting feature of them is that we're tired of pandemic politics and we want to return to normal with a responsible plan. That plan has yet to be produced, and that's why I think you're seeing such broad protests around these things. I should add, many Indo-Canadians, Sikh included, are part of the trucking community that are moving goods and services across the border and across Canada. Many Indo-Canadians are stocking the shelves of Amazon, Walmart, others, and then providing last mile delivery through Uber delivery services. Many of these are new immigrants to the country who have been a critical part of why Canada has been able to succeed through the pandemic. Almost universally, we see in suburban Canada, multicultural Canada, and rural Canada, a consensus that the country needs to move forward.
Yeah, but they're not very visible at the truckers' protests in Ottawa, are they?
They've been there. I've seen them. I mean, I've seen quite a few, but I wouldn't say that they're the vast majority.
But you are saying that it's still a peaceful protest, in its 19th or 20th day.
I haven't seen mass destruction of property. I haven't seen a storming of Parliament Hill. I haven't seen violence against people who are walking through the protests. I think they're noisy. They drive big trucks. They're loud, and they can be intimidating because they're quite large. And when you add to what the information environment is being said about them, people can feel very anxious and unsettled. But at the end of the day, we don't see the kind of mass desecration of national monuments. I think about the protests that had happened during the Black Lives Matter moment, protests on the left, if you will. And I think about how the Prime Minister waded out against public health measures into the middle of the protests in Ottawa and took a knee performatively to stand alongside those who felt that Black Canadians were being marginalized as a result of George Floyd's murder in the United States. What we're seeing here is a Prime Minister who endorses the protests he likes and condemns the ones he doesn't, uses extreme measures against one-sided views rather than a consistent approach of engagement and dialogue with broad public sentiments on either side of the spectrum toward moving the country forward. National unity rests on the shoulder of the Prime Minister, and this Prime Minister in these protests have been acting exactly against the idea of national unity.
So last couple of questions, Mr. Majumdar. The Ottawa police chief has described the protest as an insurrection. And your former Bank of Canada governor, Mark Carney, has described it as sedition. Very strong words.
Very strong words. I think that the Ottawa police chief recently had to step down as a chief of Ottawa for good reasons. At the end of the day, I think that he proved that Ottawa had been largely unprepared for protests of this scale when it would have been the job of the Ottawa police, the RCMP, and others to prepare for situations like this. Many measures could have been put in place prior to the truckers coming to Ottawa. They announced that they were coming, and barricades could have been set up to direct traffic into places that would have allowed the city of Ottawa to continue its business as usual and permit how protests would be allowed to be effective, as is the right of Canadians. And the former governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, I think waded in on an issue on the wrong side of history and the wrong side of leadership. At the end of the day, to define Canadians who want to get back to work as sedition is profoundly un-Canadian and irresponsible. And at the end of the day, I wish that the former governor of the Bank of Canada used better language to try and engage the public sentiments and de-escalate the situation rather than add oil to the fire.
So Justin Trudeau won his election just about a year or so ago. Have these incidents made him weaker, or do they make him look stronger in the eyes of the people?
To be seen. I think a lot of Canadians believe that the Prime Minister's performative politics around these truck protests have been irresponsible, including members of his own party who are now rebelling against him. I do think that a lot of Canadians have a strong sense about how the rule of law needs to be implemented when it comes to things that are frankly illegal. So blockading a critical piece of the infrastructure.
Sorry to interrupt you, but these advisors of his who you're saying are now critical of him, of the Prime Minister, could this lead to a reimagining of politics in the centre?
I think it's too soon to tell. I think at the end of the day, today it's February. It's still winter outside. It's cold. I think we'll have to wait to see over the next months how the Prime Minister decides to handle this. It strikes me that the protests and the barricades are de-escalating now, slowly and surely. People are going back home. They've made their point. Many of the protesters have made their point successfully so. And I believe they're returning to home. And we're seeing across the country in different provinces a relaxing of measures in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario. Soon, we're told, will be opening up some more. So I think the referendum on the Prime Minister's political future is yet to be seen.
Shuvaloy Majumdar, thank you so much for your time, for joining me from Ottawa.
An honor to be with you.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.